Welcome back to Herpel's Grammar Grotto. In this video, we are going to be talking about Latin verb tenses, and this will be part 2 of our Latin verb tense conversation, where we are only going to be talking about passive voice verbs, specifically the passive voice verbs that we see in the Cambridge Latin course textbook series. As we have talked about before, there are a lot of verb tenses that you guys have learned thus far or will be learning, and consistent, constant review is definitely useful when trying to become comfortable with all of these tenses, their endings, formation, identification, and translation. So again, in part 2, we're going to be dealing with present passive, imperfect passive, perfect passive, and pluperfect passive tenses. Again, a couple of reminders. First, the verb I'm going to be using is saluto, which means to greet. It is a first conjugation verb. So the first conjugation verb pattern is what we're going to be using when forming these 4 tenses. Other conjugations might have some exceptions and some very minor spelling changes, but just so you are aware, we are using the first conjugation verb patterns. Secondly, after each tense explanation, you will have some practice sentences. Feel free to pause, translate, and then press play, and your answers should show up. All right, so it's time now to go into our passive voice. The first tense we're going to be talking about is the present passive. The difference between active and passive is very specific in all languages, and I'm not going to spend time talking about it in this video, but there will be another video coming talking about active versus passive. But for now, I just want to talk about how you identify the present passive, how it's translated, and then give you some actual practice. Present passive is going to be translated am verbed, is verbed, or are verbs, depending upon what the subject is. Looking at our endings are definitely different than our active tense, or active voice, endings. We've got are, ris, ter, mer, mini, inter. Okay, so when dealing with the present passive, the way we're going to create it, you're going to take the infinitive right here, and you're going to take off the re. All right, so you can see the pattern here. Lots of verbs are created out of the infinitive. You're going to take the infinitive, you're going to take off the re, and then you're going to put your particular ending on it. So if I wanted to say he, she, or it is greeted, I'm going to take the infinitive, I'm going to take off the re, and I'm going to put the tur ending, and you have salutater. Okay, here come the sentences. Pause, do your practice, and then press play for the answers. The next verb tense is going to be imperfect passive, and the imperfect passive is going to be built right out of our present passive tense endings. You can see here we have are, ris, ter, mer, mini, and inter. Those are all of your present passive tense endings, which we just talked about. With the imperfect, all we're going to do is we're going to put a BA in front of it. So it's pretty similar to the imperfect active in that the BA is going to help you identify it as the imperfect tense. Now, it's going to be translated was or were being verbs. Now, this being is really important. If you do not have that being in the translation, it turns into the perfect passive tense. So be careful with that. It needs to be translated was or were being verbed. Just like the present passive tense, what we're going to do is create it by taking the infinitive, that second principal part, taking off that RE, and then putting your particular ending on it. So if I wanted to say he, she, or it was being greeted, I would take the infinitive, take off the RE, and then put our bater there, and you would have bater. He, she, or it was being greeted. Here are your practice sentences. Press pause, translate, and press play for your answers. The next passive verb tense is going to be the perfect passive tense. And it's going to be translated was or were verbed. Now, you can translate it has or have been verbed, but I just keep it simple and say was or were verbed. Either one is technically fine. What I would do is I would just pick one and stick with it. So the one that I've picked is was or were verbed. Perfect passive tense is going to be a two-part verb. There's two different words in it. And as you can see based on the chart, you're going to use your perfect passive participle as the first word in the verb. And then you're going to use a form of the verb to be in the present tense. So you have sum, est, sumus, estis, and sunt. Now don't be confused with this plus. You're not going to smush the words together. They're two separate words. So, for instance, if I wanted to create a perfect passive tense verb, I'm going to take my fourth principal part, salutatis, all right, and then I'm going to then write whatever form of the verb to be the subject corresponds with. So, for instance, if I wanted to say he, she, or it was greeted, I would take fourth principal part, salutatis, and then I would put the est afterward, and it would look like this. Okay, salutatis est, he, she, it was greeted. Here come your practice sentences. Press pause, translate, and then press play for your answers. The last passive verb tense we're going to be talking about is the pluperfect passive tense. Now, the pluperfect passive acts exactly like the perfect passive in that it is a two-part verb form. As you can see, you're still using your perfect passive participle as the first part, but instead of using sum, est, sumus, estis, sunt, the present form of the verb to be, we are going to be using the imperfect form of the verb to be as that second part. So we've got eram, eras, erat, and then we've got eramus, eratus, erant. We're going to be translating it had been blanked. So just like the pluperfect active has had in the translation, the pluperfect passive is going to have had as well, but we need the been in there to make it the passive voice. So to create a pluperfect passive verb, we're going to take the fourth principal part and we're going to use our correct form of the verb to be. If I wanted to say he, she, or it had been greeted, take salutatis and use the erat there to get our final form of the verb, which is salutatis erat, he, she, or it had greeted. And easy way, again, to remember it's pluperfect, we've got that ERA just like in the pluperfect active. So here are your final grouping of practice sentences. Press pause, translate, and then look for your correct answers. So, after all of that practice, after all of those tutorials, we've got 10 different verb tenses in both the active and in the passive. Again, it seems like a lot of information, but the more you practice and the more consistently you practice these verbs, both in the active and in the passive, and all of these various tenses will become second nature to you. Thank you for tuning in to this video. If you have any further questions, feel free to ask me in person, one of your classmates, or stay tuned to more videos on Herpel's Grammar Grotto on my website, herpeltopia.com. Thanks for tuning in.